But please put your hands together for the fantastic Emma Beatty. And Emma, I will invite you to introduce yourself as well. So thank you very much, Emma.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks very much, Rose, for organising this and inviting me today. Just whilst my computer figures out how it's going to share this. I'm Emma Beatty. I'm the Director of Research at MineHutte, where we focus on sort of legal risk analysis and mining codes and regulations and sort of the associated consultancy services with that. So at the heart of what we do is sort of analysing the mining laws and the environmental laws that people are going to have to comply with when they're in a jurisdiction, and providing sort of risk advice on the basis of those laws. And I think just to sort of start out where we kind of came up with the idea for what I'm going to talk about today, I think it's sort of fairly widely accepted that mining companies traditionally haven't really been that great at telling people about their role in the global economy or of the good things that they do in relation to their projects. So I'm not sure it came as any surprise to me, at least, when one of my colleagues who was working in the ESG space a lot more than I was at the time sort of mentioned that companies are having challenges in terms of how they're reporting what they're doing in terms of ESG, and how they're communicating the things that they do. But what did surprise me when we sort of started exploring it a little bit more and talking about it a little bit more, is, as someone who's been sort of reading mining laws and regulations for sort of 6 or 7 years, is how many of those standards were, to my mind, already applicable to people. And I sort of said, to my colleague, well, why don't they go and talk to their legal department? Because surely they've had to do a load of this stuff to get their license in the first place. And where we went from there was that, yes, there are lots of these standards around, and though they're not, necessarily disagreeable as standards, what do they kind of mean in practice? And are they already part of the legal framework that's sort of applicable to mining projects in lots of jurisdictions? So effectively, you can be meeting certain aspects of ESG compliance or complying with certain ESG standards essentially through your legal compliance. So you've gone through a process to meet sort of certain requirements that can then feed into your ESG reporting, and be part of that sort of ESG story that you're telling, because it's coming from those sort of legal frameworks that your project is regulated by. And just a few points here before I kind of go on to look at some examples. I'm not considering today, or not necessarily planning to consider today, whether or not it's up to governments to have legislation which fixes ESG requirements. Though I think that with the number of standards that are out there at the moment, it may well be useful for companies to see more of these kind of translated into law. And I also believe that sort of governments and their legal requirements, probably for very practical reasons, haven't necessarily been the sort of focus of ESG standards, mainly because it's easier to kind of set voluntary standards than it is to write a law or to get people to change their laws to adapt those those different aspects. And I also think it's worth noting sort of from the outset, the degree of what I'll call ESG provisions in mining law varies a lot from country to country. And what I will say on this point is that we tend to see a higher number of ESG provisions in mining laws in countries which require greater sort of contributions socially and economically from their mining sector. You'll see a lot more of the standards actually be legal standards rather than voluntary standards. And you might also see a higher volume of those standards in countries where the sort of main laws and regulations in the jurisdiction aren't as strong. So where you've got perhaps slightly weaker kind of labour and employment laws or kind of weaker human rights laws, you'll see certainly where there's been sort of international input into the mining code that's come out of it, you'll see the mining code as a much more comprehensive sort of standalone piece of legislation that relies less on sort of pulling in other laws, which we might see in more developed countries. So let's go on to look at a sort of few examples of this. I won't sort of read through these slides, and I don't necessarily think that anyone else should either, but they're just an example of how those standards are kind of translating into the provisions of the law. So I've started out with a country that I would say has fairly small levels of sort of ESG provisions, generally speaking, in their mining law, but has reacted more to sort of growing concerns in country and in the international community. So if we take a look at Brazil, I think we are starting to sort of see here that the Brazilian government has now started to kind of use the mechanism of the law to regulate things that we would now sort of class as ESG. And what I'm doing here is kind of drawing against that sort of ICMM standard as my sort of guidance for some of those ESG principles, and how that's kind of translating into the legislation. So you'll see in Brazil that if you're kind of meeting the standards in the law around tailings dams and the new sort of legal obligations that have now come around since sort of 2017 in the country, that they are now sort of meeting those environmental performance standards of the ICMM much more effectively than you might have seen in the past in Brazil, and in terms of what requirements were put on mining companies in terms of their tailings dams. So you would be sort of compliant with that particular standard of the ICMM at this point now, if you were to comply with Brazilian legislation and make sure that that was implemented effectively. And sort of turning next, I think it's pretty sort of safe to say, and I think a lot of people won't be surprised to learn that the E of ESG is much more likely to translate into legislation than certainly the S. So it's much more common to kind of see those environmental aspects of ESG addressed through the law. A lot of countries have sort of developed quite strong EIA processes and codes now, sort of in the last 5 or 10 years, though they may have issues with sort of the implementation and management of them. If you're just looking at the legal obligations that apply in the EIA space, it tends to be quite strong, and we see that here with Finland. So there's a comprehensive kind of EIA process. It involves mandatory public consultation. It involves lots of publicly available materials, and it's, you know, a key aspect of the licensing decision. So you're not going to progress with that license until this ESIA approval is obtained. But I think what's more of a surprise when we look at somewhere like Finland is we're moving kind of out of the E to the sort of S of ESG. And you're also seeing the law that addresses things like human rights. So specifically in the mining code and regulations, we're finding that ESG provisions are starting to appear. And in Finland, that's specific to sort of indigenous people. So if we look at the ICMM standards under Principle 3 in terms of, you know, respect to indigenous people and free, prior and informed consent, the way that Finland has actually structured its law means that if you have obtained your mining license, particularly in these areas, you will have gone through an incredibly rigorous process of consultations, of consent, and if at any point there is a sort of refusal or pushback, or there is a lack of consent from the community, those people will be afforded preference under the law. So it will be their say that is final. So if they reject the project, then the project will not proceed. So we're seeing not just the sort of E of ESG being addressed through the law, we're also seeing that S addressed through the law as well. And so for the sort of next country that I'm going to look at, I thought it would be useful to take a look at a country where, first of all, I think people might be quite surprised to learn that there are relatively high sort of ESG standards, or perhaps the opposite way of saying it is true, is that they would think that maybe your ESG wouldn't be as high. But B, where in fact a country where the legal framework contains some of the highest sort of levels of ESG provisions I've ever seen in the sort of 120, 130 mining codes that I've read. So in the case of Malawi, social and environmental standards are incredibly stringent under the law. You'll have to meet a whole number of them just in order to kind of progress to your licensing. And I think Ludovine sort of touched upon earlier the sort of, it's part of that permitting process. Well, certainly in Malawi, you're going to find that you are addressing a whole number of ESG considerations in your ability to obtain a mining license. I've touched upon the sort of human rights aspects there that apply at both the kind of exploration stage and moving on to the mining stage, and also those ESIA structures that we talked about earlier, but also in terms of your social performance. So all the kind of requirements that the ICMM are setting out as ESG standards under Principle 9, social performance. If you sort of follow certainly the letter of the law in Malawi, you're going to find that you're meeting those standards quite well. And I think though you are absolutely undoubtedly going to grapple with the sort of challenges that people have raised here in terms of monitoring and managing your obligations and your commitments in Malawi, because you will have a whole lot of them by the end of this licensing process. If you're following the letter of the law, really regardless of whether or not the government itself has the capacity to monitor it, which I think is certainly going to be a question in Malawi, you will be answering a whole host of kind of ESG concerns on the investor side purely by compliance with that law and the implementation of it. And in theory, this is the only way in Malawi for you to maintain your license, is by meeting and continuing to meet these ESG requirements sort of throughout the course of your project, and implementing these plans and programs that you've sort of set out. So your social performance effectively is being dictated by your licensing obligations, and by those obligations that you've made at the point at which you've obtained a mining license. And in Malawi, which you don't often see, but you certainly see here, is that all the commitments and obligations that are set out under those plans and programs that you submit as part of your license application actually form conditions of your license. It's not enough to just sort of submit them and have them exist. You are bound by their terms, and they do form part of your license terms and conditions. So that's me. It's a very quick overview of kind of your legal obligations and how we're seeing those standards translate through into your ESG requirements.
Fantastic. That was absolutely brilliant. So round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for the fantastic Emma Beatty. That was brilliant. And don't worry, all of the slides, the recording, etc., will be available for you. So if you want to see some of that detail that Emma was flashing up on the screen in front of you later, you will be able to check it out. So Emma, just while waiting for more of the questions to land, and there are lots of questions coming in for you. So why Malawi? Why does Malawi have such stringent rules? What makes it so special?
It's a good question. The mining code being 200 pages long, I would say, is one of them. No, I think basically what we've seen in Malawi really is a culmination of a lot of the kind of activity where consultants have sort of played a role in drafting mining laws. So I think we've really reached the sort of ultimate consultant's version of what a mining law should look like. Now, from a risk perspective, I'm not necessarily saying that tying these obligations to your ability to obtain your license is a very good thing, especially when they're kind of discretionarily assessed by the government in terms of are they satisfactory or not. But in terms of your ESG requirements and what you're being asked to sort of do with it, Malawi has really kind of set out its stall as using its mining code basically to draw as much benefit as it can out of industry. And I think part of that, I understand that there's been sort of consultants involved in that, but I think also part of it is that by making these legal obligations, Malawi, which is going to be very, very reliant on what is at the moment quite a junior mining industry, will sort of realize the benefits of that in the way that countries with perhaps older mining industries that haven't sort of had that structure around them have maybe done. And I think they've definitely used the mining law as that kind of catch-all. So to address all your other concerns, your labour and employment concerns, your health and safety concerns, your social responsibilities, they've really used the mining law as a sort of governing code for all aspects of your project, which you don't tend to see in countries, as I said earlier, where they tend to draw from kind of other laws and regulations that are applicable there. Malawi really is saying, the mining law is critical to your project.
And what do you think is better, or is it just context specific, if a country manages to pull it all together in a nice cohesive package like Malawi, or other countries where they're pulling together different strands of existing law? What tends to work better?
I don't necessarily think that we sort of have the answer to that yet. I think it kind of remains to be seen, because one of the problems with putting a law like this down in somewhere like Malawi is what I touched on earlier, is, you know, what does the capacity look like to monitor? You know, if one mining project has to submit 13 programs and plans, what's the capacity like to monitor how those plans are being implemented? Not just the challenges, as Ludovine spoke about, of sort of the companies being able to manage them, but what is the government's ability to be able to manage them? So whilst I think it makes it simpler to have it in that kind of package, I'm not 100% convinced that a mining law that's as long and kind of as onerous as the one that Malawi has in place will be effective unless it's implemented and monitored in the way that it's meant. And I think some focus has to be paid on, you know, the capacity that Malawi has to kind of implement the law it's been given. Otherwise, it's only really as useful as the sort of paper it's written on.
So actually very similar to what Elaine, for example, was saying, is you actually have to use it. You can't just write down that plan. You actually need to make it mean something and then monitor it as well to make sure it's actually being implemented.
Exactly. And I think the sort of the case in Malawi really needs to be that sort of collaborative relationship between the sort of company and the government. I don't think, you know, the answer certainly shouldn't be from the company side, not that I'm suggesting it would, but, you know, well, the government are never going to be able to monitor all this stuff, so why should we do it? I think you're going to have to build those sort of collaborative relationships and be working on building the government's capacity to monitor your obligations too.
So that's the case there. And I think you make a really good point. So this isn't just something where all the onus is on the mining companies. It's also on that capacity and capability and understanding of the likes of government. And in a few minutes, we are going to then go sideways into the world of finance, because we're going to pull in Paul Pritchard and ask him to say, okay, what are some of the changes that have been happening in the world of finance? But before we do that, Paul, so we're almost coming to you, sir. There are a couple more questions, Emma. So from Brad Wilson, he asks, how does, say, the World Bank or, say, mining insurance play a role in the legislative side of ESG? So, I mean, how does that drive things? And I know we're going to come on to that, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective. So how does finance and insurance drive some of the legislative side?
Well, I don't think that, I mean, finance in terms of the sort of funding from the World Bank to reform mining codes, I think has been quite critical to a lot of countries in terms of that kind of capacity and sort of getting laws in place that are suitable for the regulation of industry. I'm not yet sure that they've kind of found the ground between the sort of, you know, the companies that have to implement and abide by these laws, and, as I said before, the sort of consultant's dream of what that law should look like versus, I suppose, the alternative, which is the investor's dream of what that mining code should look like. So I'm not sure that the World Bank necessarily, the sort of world of finance and insurance, have yet made sort of considerable strides, at least in recognizing that they're implementing ESG provisions. I think there's certainly been an increasing requirement to see sort of social obligations included in mining laws and regulations. And I think a lot of the sort of drive behind that has certainly come from institutions like the World Bank, who, you know, sort of see the benefit in that being a legal obligation rather than a sort of voluntary standard. But I don't think there is yet a drive to sort of say, actually, if you want to set your ESG standards, we're going to use your mining code to do it. I don't think we're yet seeing that kind of translate through to mining laws in any or at least make sort of substantial differences to mining laws than what we've seen in the past. So I'm not sure we've yet seen that translate into legislation, although I would imagine that we will at some point.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. And one final question. So this is from John Clark, and he says, so you've mentioned many different types of management plans and assessments. Is there international guidance with regards to what constitutes a good management plan or EIA, etc., or is that something that is needed?
I definitely think it's something that's needed. I think it's needed not just from the sort of side of the people having to put them out there, but also to give mining companies sort of actual objective standards and programs together, because if you actually read the sort of Malawi's legislation through, you'll see that the only actual requirement for these plans and programs is that they are to the satisfaction of government, which is not a particularly content guidance that anybody can take and kind of make anything of. And I think that certainly it would be a lot more beneficial to companies to see at least minimum content requirements and things like that as form part of at least the decision-making process as to how we're going to deem something satisfactory or not. So no, there are not those standards, and there are not kind of international standards in what looks good. I think probably you'll see them more in the sort of, as I said, in the environmental space than anywhere else. But in terms of, you know, what makes for a good procurement program, what makes for a good community development agreement, I think no is the answer. And I think the world itself, or the mining industry, certainly would benefit from some sort of boundaries and frameworks being set in terms of that content.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Emma Beatty.